Okay, thank you guys for hanging in there. Sorry, we was trying to get the Zoom link working. We do not have a microphone for tonight, so if you are going to issue a public comment, if you could come as close to our owl as possible so that our friends on Zoom can hear you, and we'll do our best to be loud enough for you all to hear, but if you cannot hear, scooch in. So I'm gonna call the meeting to order at 6:40 p.m. We have our minute taker Vicky here. And Mike, timekeeper,
Sure.
are you able to? Thanks. Our first action for tonight is our first action for tonight is public comment. But I was hoping that everyone who's here might allow me or indulge me in a small preamble before we open this meeting. Because first I'd really like to extend my appreciation to all those people sitting around me, especially this board who's only been here for a few short weeks, but they have given me so much evidence of the embodiment of what it means to be a board member. It's been really inspiring to see how dedicated and connected and driven you've all been just within those few short weeks, and it's given me a lot of hope for how we're going to continue to do this work all together. So thank you very much. I asked the board tonight and going forward to continue your work and to reconsider how we might collectively take some ownership of this owner accountable organization, how we can affect change through that ownership, and how we can use our collective skills in communication, organization, and thoughtfulness to bring balance back to our policy and governance structure. Next, there's no denying that there's some energy surrounding the topics on our agenda for this evening. We're in the midst of a fundamental disagreement in our district, and I have no doubt that some of what we will hear tonight will speak to those disagreements. The conversations we have to have are going to be hard. They're going to be uncomfortable. They're going to be demanding on all of us, but they're necessary for dismantling the barriers to communication, aligning on wants and needs, and reducing our resistance to change. So my plea to all those here tonight is to remember who we're here for, to demonstrate that the history of our collective experience is allowing us to be here today, to exert our energy and to test our abilities of grit and resilience so we continue working together for our district students. Lastly, just a reminder that all public comments are welcome. We extend a 3-minute time limit per individual comment and 6 minutes for those of you wishing to speak on behalf of a collective. All comments exceeding those times will need to be finished in written form. Any comments that impede the rights and dignity of staff or children or administration or board members may be interrupted at any point in the comment, and we'll ask you to submit the rest of your comment in writing. We follow the Roberts Rules of Order, which means we will not directly answer your public comment right now because it's not a question and answer platform, but we're hoping that any questions you have tonight might be answered through our discussion tonight. Thank you for indulging me. With that, I will open the floor for public comment.
This is close enough.
That's great.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Sarah Mangini. I'm co-president of the Mount Abraham Education Association, or MAEA, as you all know. We understand that a reduction in staff will unfortunately be necessary if the revised budget is voted down in a couple of weeks. And we also knew going into this last week that on or before April 1st, people covered under our negotiated agreement for licensed staff would either be issued a contract for the coming school year or possibly receive a RIF notice. That this was a possibility was not a surprise. What did come as a shock, however, was the extent of the proposed layoffs. 18 teachers throughout the district received these notices. We are very concerned that all of the cuts were to people who work directly with students. We urge our administrative team and the board to prioritize maintaining student-facing positions. Where else could cuts be made? The core classroom teaching staff, specialists in the arts, and all people who directly support students should be the last to get cut. It is our hope that the new budget will be approved by voters so that we can continue to offer a wide range of learning opportunities for MAUSD students. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Shauna. I'm here, a resident of Bristol. I have one son at Mount Abe and one at Bristol Elementary. I'm concerned, just like everybody else, there seems to be a major disagreement as far as the budget and the school climates. What I would ask as someone that seeing is believing, if we could see some more details about the budgets, then maybe we would be less concerned. For instance, when you're looking at one report for the budget detail, it's in a totally separate format from the new budget presentation. And trying to compare things doesn't make sense when it's not in the same format. And I do bookkeeping for a living, so to me, it should be easy, but it's not. If we actually understood more of the items behind the different categories, we might be less upset. But right now, hearing that teachers are going to get cut when ultimately there's not enough staff to begin with. The school climate is horrifying. Kids need help and they don't need teachers cut. If it's our property taxes that are being affected, then we should get to decide where that budget gets cut. If we don't want more construction because it's not a priority over teachers, I would gladly choose teachers any day. That's what's important. The maintenance, repair and maintenance is necessary, but improvements are not when it comes to choosing between my students' welfare and the next capital improvement. So I ask if we could just have more, just more, so that we can actually see what is necessary and allow us to have a say in what we want cut, not just deciding for us. That would maybe make it a little less heated. So that's all I ask.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nola Roberts. I am a Mount Abe student here with other Mount Abe students to talk about the issues that we're seeing. Throughout my experience here at Mount Abe, one of my favorite things seeing about the school is the amount of different courses offered to us. It is truly one of the best things that our school has. It really creates a diverse community and gives us opportunities that we would not have otherwise. The language department, the wood shop, the technology, and the arts department are all so integral to the community that we have here at Mount Abe. I speak from personal experience about the arts department as someone who is very connected to that department itself. As someone who wants to go into the arts as a career, it has been extremely important to my education. And I feel that cutting these opportunities for students is not the right way for the school board to go about budgeting. It's taking away these opportunities for future generations and is making it harder for students to have these integral experiences that they need. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other public comment at this time?
I think I taste the room.
Totally.
My name is Ryan Strobel. I'm a high school art teacher here at Mount Abe. One of two high school art teachers. And if this budget fails, if it's voted down, I will lose my job. But more importantly, the high school will lose half of our art department. And as devastated as I would be to lose my own job, I know that the entire community and the student body would be hurt. And I'm only speaking for our school and our department. I know that all these things hold true to all the other schools and many other teachers. But we are a community that values the arts, prides ourselves in the arts, and I think it's something that sets us apart from a lot of districts and schools in the state of similar sizes and profiles. It's part of our identity as a school and as a community. And I guess I wanted to turn and face the community because it's really more of a plea to all of you who are going to the polls to approve the budget as sort of a short-term solution and help maintain the strength of our schools as they are. A lot of my students are here right now, I'm proud of them. And I've seen firsthand how huge of an impact our arts programming that we provide has on students. And I know how devastating of a loss it would be. It's a little shocked to see that half of our arts department is on the chopping block. I think that's sort of a different issue to address. Ultimately, when we're voting for our values. So I personally value the incredible community that we have and the way that the arts are embedded in that community. And I want to maintain that. So I would encourage everybody to vote yes and approve the budget. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Karen, can I say one more thing?
Let me just double check that no other public comments are being made, then yes. Anyone else for public comment?
I guess I'd like to say how miserable it is to have a.
Would you mind coming up? Oh, yeah.
Right.
Just give us your name before you start.
Whitney Jermon. I just like to tell everybody how wonderful it is at once a year, Art on Main hosts the school for their beautiful art exhibits. And everyone who comes is just wild about what their capabilities that are coming out of this place. So,
Thank you.
My name is Deb Baker. I'm the art teacher at Bristol Elementary School and a resident of Moncton. All three of my children have gone through this school. And on top of the fact that I'm incredibly heartbroken that the arts were greatly impacted with this riff sequence with two music teachers at the elementary level have received rifts. I'm more concerned about the fact that many people I know still plan on not voting yes on this budget. And it's not because of they don't want to save the teachers. It's because they're not happy about where the money is and what's not being cut and what is being cut. And in a way, it feels almost like the teachers whose jobs are affected are sort of the reason why the budget needs to be passed. And it's almost a situation where, well, what do we do? You know, of course, I'm going to vote yes, but you know, I want the teachers, but at the same time, it still doesn't get the message through. And I think it's very important that the message needs to be understood that a lot of people aren't unhappy about the money and the fact they have to pay taxes. They're unhappy about where the money is going and where the money is not going. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Aaron looks like there's one online.
Right. Wendy on Zoom.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I just want to echo Deb Rickner's thoughts and many other parents' thoughts. My name is Wendy Lossman, in case you didn't hear. I am a past employee of BES. I'm a taxpayer. I'm a grandma of a BES student. My concern is not with the size of the budget necessarily. It's with where the money is going. The money needs to go to our teachers, to our arts staff, to our music staff, all those things. We are a very top-heavy district. We have a lot of people in central office. And I guess I hear over and over, and I'm wondering myself, why, if our numbers are dropping, do we not ever see any cuts in central office? We only see cuts in the people who work directly with our children. We need hands-on people with our kids, boots on the ground. We don't need 100 people sitting in central office or however many people you have over there. We need to prioritize and look at where we can make some cuts. And I agree that I feel like the taxpayer should have a little more say in where our money goes in the school district. The teachers are doing a wonderful job. I respect the school board 100%, but I just feel like you need to listen to the taxpayers a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Wendy. Anyone else? Shauna, if you want to do your second comment.
Thank you again. What I wanted to say is that listening to the teachers, to lose the arts program, to have any of them losing their jobs and being told that they have to convince the community to pass it, that that's their responsibility, isn't fair. We are being held hostage to keeping their jobs, that's on us. That's not on us. That's not on the community. If we're not being given the choice, but told that we can either choose to have these teachers lose their jobs or choose the higher taxes, and that's it, that's not fair for us. If we don't have a say in where it's going, then we don't have any choices but to lose the arts, to have all the teachers lose their services, to lose support services. So basically saying we have to choose between our children's welfare and taxes. We're being held hostage. That's exactly what that is. And the teachers should not be told that they have to convince the community, that he has to convince people and be up here telling us how important the arts are. We already know this, but we shouldn't be held accountable for them losing their jobs because we didn't get to decide where that money went. If you ask the community, we would tell you that's not what we want. We would tell you, like what people are saying, we should have a say, and holding us hostage to people losing their jobs and holding us hostage to our kids losing out isn't fair for any of the community. And that's something that the school board really needs to reconsider. And I think it's overwhelming that the community is saying this. So I think you really need to listen here because it's not acceptable at all.
One last call for public comment at this time.
Alan Quitner. As an educator myself, I would like to see all teaching staff reinstated. The teachers are the heartbeat of the school. I used to stand in a hall once in a while talking to the kids. Where are you going? I'm going to art. They love it. I'm going to phys ed. I'm going to shop. Each kid, and some of the kids, I'm going to the cafeteria. That was their heartbeat. So what I'm saying to you is, I look at this budget. You need to communicate somehow if they'll press on the link. Now, I put something on the Starksboro Forum. I called some of my friends. What did you think of my article? It was great. Did you click the link? Oh, I don't know. I didn't. So it's important. Somehow we got to get the links clicked by the community. If we don't get the links clicked, every year it's going to be the same. It's a struggle. I remember the superintendent patting me on the back. Alan, what do you want? We gave you a 5-cent raise last year. So the school is key. And I want to see every teacher back in the staff And the only thing I could see is where all the teachers rift because of the time frame.
Not a Q&A, but
What?
it's not a question and answer platform.
Well, I think it's
hopefully-
key that these people know that everybody was riffed because we didn't know what to do, and that happens in a lot of communities. Cause you're at the second vote or something and you just send everybody a notice. So, they should know, these people should know. So what we could do, let's reinstate the teachers. Let's look at some of these 4 million, 2 million, $1 million items on this budget. Can we do without them and see? It's simple. If you don't have good teaching staff, and the ones here evidently are quite good. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, I'm gonna close this public comment for right now and we'll move on. Our first action item is to approve the agenda. Can I please get a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Kathy,
I'll second that.
Justin? All those in favor of approving the agenda for tonight, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No abstentions, the motion passes. Our second item is the consent agenda. We have 2 resignations on that for tonight. Can I please get a motion for the consent agenda?
So moved.
Kathy?
Second.
Melissa, was that you? Melissa, thank you. All those in favor of approving the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? That motion passes. All right. Our next item is for board management and governance, and the first discussion item is budget feedback from the community. So over the past couple meetings, we've gotten a lot of feedback. We also got a lot of feedback tonight. And some of the feedback we've gotten is sort of echoed here tonight, but we have a few buckets of information, and I've sort of tried to capture those buckets in a way that maybe we could discuss them, but I wanted to open the floor first to any board members who might have ideas about where you might like to start in the budget feedback discussion. Yes, Liz?
Is it okay to start with, maybe some further understanding about, the percentage of, should we have to go back to a budget that is the same as last year's amount of money? That there was a percentage of that that would be professional staff and a percentage that wouldn't be. And why we might right now know about professional staff and not about other positions that would also be cut. And I would be planned to be cut as a part of that.
In the interest of the public, can you speak louder?
Oh,
Because we
sorry.
cannot understand the word here.
Sorry. So I was asking about if, we could understand a little more, get some more information around that if we were to have to go back to the budget from last year, why we, would know about the professional staff that could be affected with RIFs and what further percentage of cuts would come from outside of professional staff and why we wouldn't know about those quite yet. Even though, and that there is a percentage that would also be non-professional staff.
Yeah, so the way the process works, in the absence of a budget that has been approved, when we reach a point in time when contracts are due to be issued, I have to assume that the level of spending we have to work with is the same level of spending that we have in the current year's budget. So when we compare the current year's spending to the original proposed budget, that's a little over $3 million different. And so as I think I've made really clear, I was really interested in either setting a budget vote date for the second vote that was before April 1st, which is the deadline when either contracts or RIFs are needed. Or if that wasn't an option, extending the April 1st deadline to after the budget vote. I was not successful in either of those things. And so the result is I had to sort of assume a worst case scenario. I'll put that in quotes because it can always be worse, but sort of worst case scenario that we have a level spending budget to work with. So I needed to issue enough RIF notices to the licensed staff specifically, because that's the only group of employees that had an April 1 deadline. So not all of the savings would come from that group. There are savings that would come from other areas, but the only notifications at this point in time that were necessary were from the licensed staff group. And if the budget passes, none of that's needed. So the idea that that's a strategy to sort of hold hostage, like I couldn't have been more explicit about not wanting to have to issue those RIF notices. And for good reason, I had to. And that's sort of where we are. So the timing was key in how that all panned out.
Yeah, Barb.
So, I am speaking from my place as an art educator, and, I'm heartbroken. I know what the rationale is. And I know that hopefully these RIFs won't need to be used. But I am completely, it's kind of blindsided me. And I don't understand how, I don't understand how the arts were targeted first. So I'm just gonna come out and say that. So I'd like to know the rationale.
I can speak to that a little bit,
Okay.
if that's helpful.
Yeah.
So we, over the past several months as an admin team, we have intentionally, in the absence of budget pressures, we have really looked at staffing guidelines, education quality standards, a lot of resources to think about what are the staffing rules that we want to make sure we're adhering to as we can anticipate future challenges. That was one of the links I shared with the board that will become part of the public record for this meeting following this. And so in developing that gave me something to lean on as we looked at adhering to those staffing levels in light of what have been in the reality. Floyd did some work over these last couple of days. Over the past 8 years, we've actually reduced about 40 something positions, almost all through attrition. And almost all of that has kind of gone under the radar because it hasn't been the public facing RIF process and everything that we're sort of experiencing now. And it hasn't come on the heels of defeated budgets. It's been our practice, which is recognized, Nate Levinson is recognized as good practice to take advantage of attrition when it presents. And we've done that a lot. And so over that time, our staffing levels have changed, and the number of staff we need in certain areas is dependent upon the number of classrooms and other factors. We haven't forced attrition to sort of right size, if you will, because we've been just taking advantage of it as it presents itself. We were put in a position with a failed budget and having to make this assumption about a worst case scenario that forced us to have to right size that way. So it wasn't so much targeting any particular department or area, it was leaning on staffing rules, how many staff we need in the various areas to run the programming that we need to have.
So if I may, it looks like here, full-time employment is based on the sections. So is there even a possibility? I'm just wondering how, this works, like cutting a whole position. Is there a way to, to rethink this? I would ask that the board rethink this.
So an important piece to understand in terms of the process because a person in a school is the result of a RIF, that doesn't mean that that school's where that reduction happens, right? So if we were reducing the equivalent of 1.0 art across all the elementary schools, but the least senior art teacher is at Mount Abe, because art is a position under the collective bargaining agreement that is K-12. Even though the actual reduction might happen at the elementary school level, the person impacted happens to work at Mount Abe. And then we have to sort of shuffle FTEs to fill in what's needed to run the programming that we're looking for. So that's a difficult thing to understand, but the reality is the perception of how an individual school is impacted can't be derived by the people who receive the RIF notifications. It's much more complex than that.
Yeah, Liz.
Only because it goes directly to that, is that this is what the Nate Levinson suggestion of extreme sister schools looks like. That's taking the Nate Levinson report has one of the suggestions in it is extreme sister schools and sharing staff. So this is that stress of that, and I think it was an explanation of why that's very challenging to provide for a staff member to provide services across multiple school buildings, and why that's challenging. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Kathy?
When we look at reductions, overall reductions, where did we look at reductions in central office staffing? In addition to worrying about teachers and riffing and meeting the April 1 deadline that nobody wanted to be flexible. Where did we look at central office staffing?
So I'm not prepared to go there now. I issued notices only for the group that had an April 1 deadline. I haven't had any conversations with anybody else that would be impacted, and I don't think it's good practice for that to surface right now in this conversation.
I think we've heard it pretty clearly from a lot of folks that, I mean, I know I didn't look at those cuts particularly because we were faced with that April 1 deadline, and I'll take that responsibility, but I also know that going forward, I want to take the responsibility for looking at cuts across the board. I think that is really pertinent.
But I think also acknowledging that those cuts are from that area, or potentially the facilities, like we heard tonight, like maybe we don't need to upgrade the library, but we want to keep 3 teachers. Like, were those even on the list? Recognizing they didn't have to be alerted for April 1st, but were they on the list? Are they on the list? Should this budget be voted down? And helping us to understand that as a board and also the community.
So there was already $250,000 that came out of that fund, right? The construction services. So that's in what's being voted on. I also think it's important to remember we can spend all of our time talking about the budget that will follow this one if it fails. And we have a responsibility between now and April 16th to inform people about the budget they're actually going to be voting on. So I just want to acknowledge the need for time on that issue as well. And again, so I'm not in a position right now to talk about all the other cuts that aren't at a point where they need to be notified right now.
What we do have going for us, though, is that this isn't the only time we can have conversations that are really difficult. I think we've had our eyes kind of peeled open by how difficult this has been for our community to grapple with. And there's a lot at stake for going forward. We have a lot of decisions to make, a lot of community input to take in and make informed choices with. We have 2 weeks between now and when our community needs to vote on a budget. And we need to be able to get as much information to our community about that budget and why it allows us to have those hard conversations going forward. So I don't want this to feel like the only time that we have to ask these really difficult questions of each other. I think there'll be plenty of opportunities to start doing that, a lot more digging. But
Another
keep-
important process question that I was just reminded of as you were sharing, Aaron, the assumption I had to make in light of the timing of all this was sort of that worst case scenario that we have a level spending budget. That isn't necessarily true, even if this budget fails on April 16th. The board doesn't have to set level spending as the next target. Could be a different target. But that was sort of the fail safe that I had to work with in the absence of something that's approved. The actual target I'm gonna have to hit is set by this board, should this next vote fail. I don't know what that is.
Brad,
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense is that there's a bit of a tension or a disconnect between the legal requirements that the board and administration were under with respect to the collective bargaining agreement. And that the worst case, and as a board member, I certainly haven't taken any kind of a vote about whether or not the art department or the music department or the history department for that matter gets emasculated. It seems to me that the requirement that again, the legal requirement that we notify staff that it's possible that the budget is not going to pass and will be in a worst case scenario is something we had to do. And in some ways it makes, as much as I appreciate the conversations that are taking place tonight a lot about with respect to what Barb was saying about the arts and stuff. It seems to me that it's a little bit premature for for what we're facing right now in passing this budget. I am also, I am sympathetic to the comments made about kind of holding teachers hostage. I mean, that sort of, yeah, I mean, that's kind of been sort of the de facto result of the legal process mechanism that we've had to go down. But that is totally separate from what I think this board will, if the budget doesn't pass and we have to be adhere to a level budget from last year or the current year, I find it hard to believe that cuts are only going to come from teachers and not from across the board. So again, I just feel there's a kind of disconnect in the discussion here.
Kathy?
I think there's a problem with the timing of all of this as well. And we didn't do a good enough job to get the information out as quickly as we needed to. And now we're having to play catch up with what's happened and what's going to happen. So I guess my question is to all of us is what's our next step as far as getting the information out that's going to really represent what the budget means overall, not just in the RIF notices that had to go out because of terms of contract. But what does it mean overall? And how do we get that information to the populace in an understandable format?
So what was missing from the Article 1 explanation on our flyer? That pretty much describes what we're doing to reduce the budget.
Well, what we heard in the Finance and Facilities Committee tonight was that it didn't at all appear to be budget, apples to apples, oranges to oranges, that the format was off so that you couldn't compare what the current presentation is to what was the budget that we put up for a vote. And that it's not easy to get to the links to get the additional information.
Yeah, Liz?
Community Engagement Committee had some ideas come up about connecting with our select boards. There's a group in Moncton that is very excited and wants to support getting the word out to support our schools. So doing some work to facilitate conversations around the community to understand the difference between the budget that was denied and the one that we're asking to be approved and what the changes are, which is hopefully, Mike's putting something together. We've got the flyer and as much communication as possible about why we stand behind or why we've put forward the next budget that we're asking the voters to approve. So that was select board words, yeah.
I think it's really valuable to point out that though this is our community and our heart and our neighbors and our teachers and our friends who are all impacted by this, we're not functioning in a silo right now. So many communities in Vermont are grappling with this. And our neighbors next door, Addison Northwest, with a much smaller population, had twice as many RIFs go out. And so I'm just thinking about it too, from those bigger systems of like, we're functioning within these systems that are state systems, to try to do the best work forward. But so much is not within our control to be able to do that. And I'm really just kind of curious about the impact of all of the votes in the state and how that will impact the legislature moving forward and how we fund education in our state.
You know, I'll just jump in. I echo your sentiment, and I think it's even better, excuse me, might be even better if we take a step back further. Like, we have the immediate communication needs, and the hope is events like this tonight. We have another meeting next week. Tonight, we have a draft presentation that I put together that actually speaks to statewide issues, that speaks to local issues, that directly tries to make explicitly clear the differences between the original proposed budget and the draft budget. So I think we're building towards that. And yet at the same time, I hear from the community that what we've done hasn't been sufficient up to this point, right? And so we have this long-term problem of how do we facilitate productive conversations across the multiple communities, which I think is challenging, right? For example, I posted in the Bristol Front Porch Forum yesterday, and some of you may have read that, but it didn't go to the rest of the town. Like, we as a board have long-term challenges with communication that I think my sense is the board is committed to coming up with better solutions. I'll also point out on the flip side of that, that takes engagement the other way. I love seeing everybody here tonight and everybody online. I also hosted we hosted, but I've read presentations leading up to the original budget that were far less attended. And I get it. It's a busy world. There's a lot going on. The communication and improved communication in the long run is going to have to be a two-way street. There's a lot of heavy lifting here. I get it. But it also means continuous engagement, not at the 11th hour from the board and not at the 11th hour from the community when those tensions are necessarily high, but at times when the temperature is a little bit lower and we can have thoughtful discussions that are sort of predicated on forward thinking rather than solving the immediate crisis. So I echo the concerns about communication. I feel them inherently as a board member, not even sure exactly how I can do that role effectively. But I'm optimistic that we can continue to move forward and that as a Band-Aid in the interim, these kinds of meetings, the meeting on the 9th, and continued dialogue might get us to the place where on the 16th, we feel confident knowing what we're voting for and why that ultimately is the budget that's on the table at this moment in time.
Any other thoughts from people? Like I said, I do have some buckets we could dip into if we wanted to continue this discussion item. Or we could move to the next discussion, which is the New Solutions K-12 report, which is the Levinson's report.
What do you mean by buckets?
So over the past couple of meetings we've had, so really specifically the 12th and the 26th, we got a lot of feedback from our community about, basically what I did was take themes of the questions we've been asked to consider as we're looking forward for budget building. So that's what I mean by buckets that I have. We could we could look at talking about if we were feeling like we needed to dig in more to some questions.
Love to hear your themes.
You'd love to hear the themes, okay. So the themes that I have collected so far, and there are probably more out there. We have the stakeholder and owner response to the budget and tax impact, and how it does not adequately reflect their priorities for education. And that includes the potential for loss of teachers, among other things. We have a theme of being bound to create a budget on the state's implied formulas for the use of funds, which is not an area the board or administration has any say over. We have a theme of the authority of the superintendent and the decisions and best practices in education we use, and that's based on our policy and governance structure. We have a theme of the buckets of money being used to reduce spending. We have a theme of being asked what's different between the failed budget and this new budget. The actual tax impact of the new budget versus the old budget. The community versus administrative views on the RIFs and cuts. The theme of a scare tactic for confronting or talking openly about what the intentions are for the RIFs. Administrative costs analysis, so defining what central office is or what other layers exist for central office or other administrative staff. We have a theme of dismantling the central office as it stands. We have a theme of how are we going to replace ed reserve funds that we're borrowing to help this budget make it so we can keep all of our staff. And we have a few other themes, the collaboration with teachers for creative problem solving. And the last theme is the risk of underfunding schools to the point where they're no longer safe or functional. Those are the main themes we've gotten out of the last 2 meetings that I could find.
Those are good.
Those are
Thank
good
you.
themes.
Yeah.
So I would like to maybe regurgitate my spiel from the last meeting on one other topic in the room that doesn't get discussed much.
Sure.
Mike, I think you brought a good point up last meeting that we're level servicing this budget in our original budget. And the cost of that budget was acceptable to the voters during our last budget session. If you go back a couple of budgets ahead of that, there's really nothing in those budgets or in this last budget that changed in a fundamental way. And there was nothing in those budgets that drove the cost to taxpayers to a level that everybody's alarmed about. This budget has particular features that drive the budget to a level that nobody's comfortable with. And one of the primary drivers of that change at a double-digit level is new teacher salaries. Now, that's a taboo subject to talk about most of the time. But I want to bring it up because somebody was saying that we're holding people hostages either to pay more taxes or to get rid of teachers. Now, at the last meeting, I mentioned that the big thing that happened during this last couple of budgets is the COVID pandemic and the inflation that happened along with it. There was a huge bubble in inflation. You've all experienced it. That's driven up healthcare costs. That's driven up all sorts of costs. It subsequently has made it a priority for the NEA to try to settle around the state for double-digit pay increases. And in some cases, asking for 2 to 3, maybe 4 times more than what a traditional bargaining session might produce. Those requests may have real merit. And in case of the COVID inflation can directly be attributable to that. What the remainder of it is, I think the union may need to explain. They may need to provide more information to the public to help bolster their position for doing that. Those costs, those double-digit pay increases have been settled in enough places around the state now that that's having a direct impact on the yield that the state can set for your base homestead rate. The property tax formula has not changed over the last couple of years. That's really not the issue. The weighting formula has some winners and losers across the state. We happen to be a winning district. We have 170 more equalized people and a lower cost per pupil because of the weighting formula. So it's not something Montpelier did in this last session. It's not the property tax formula. We've had that for a while. We know what's going on with that. But something that is directly affecting the majority of our costs, which is teacher salaries. That's by far and away the biggest budget item we have, is being settled around the state for double digits. And when that happens, bam, you see a direct impact on your property taxes at a double-digit rate, which has got everybody alarmed. However, it may be worth, the Vermont NEA stepping up and saying, yes, you're seeing that and we deserve it, and here are the reasons why. And I think that would go a very long way for people to get behind some of these budgets that they're scared to support right now. We've not really done anything different over the last couple of years with our budget. We've been very good, I think, about keeping a lid on the increases. We've had almost no control over this increase. So I really think that we need help from the teachers as well as, the board looking in all the different pockets to support this budget for their own sakes. If the double-digit increases on the salary level raise the total expenditure that the state has to raise across the board for everybody. We've not seen those double-digit increases here in this district yet because we haven't finished negotiating for our contracts for that reason. If we settle for those at those levels in our upcoming sessions, you're going to see these increases at a property tax level again. But that may be justifiable. That may be supportable. The teachers certainly have way more community support and way more social capital than the board or the administration. And I think it may be time for the teachers to spend a little and help us out.
Yeah, Melissa.
Thank you. So I think to add to that for me, so across every facet, right? Groceries, heating oil, I don't care, healthcare costs, everything is going up, right? So we're all feeling the pinch on our wallets, regardless of what you're buying, whether it's educational services or popcorn at the grocery store. And as your newest board member, it's my first meeting, so bear with me here. I think the challenge that I'm hearing from our community members is they might be okay with those double-digit increases if they felt they had the support in the school. And they're challenged because the teachers don't feel supported by the administration. And so going, okay, well then let's just double-digit increase when they're already not feeling supported. Well, maybe that's in their paycheck. Maybe it's not though. And we haven't, as a board, done a great job of helping them understand where all those dollars are. It's hard to say, yeah, I'm gonna vote for that because it's gonna hurt my wallet. I don't understand where the money's going, and I'm still struggling every day when I walk in to take care of my kids. That's the gap we need to bridge as the board, we're not gonna solve all those problems tonight in the next, I don't know, half an hour. We have a lot of work to do, I think collectively, the community, as we've talked about, as Mike said, collectively, the community, the board, the administration, together, we have to band together and be rowing in the same direction. Right now, we need to help the people sitting here, the people on Zoom, and the people that aren't here today understand this budget and what we put forward, with the understanding of we are hearing them. And we're gonna work to fix some of this if we can and make an impact and make change. But I think if we don't allow our community members to walk away with that feeling, we're gonna be right back here in a couple of weeks talking about the budget again.
Now this,
I appreciate that a lot. I also want to say that there is more. And I'm glad that we're looking at the Nate Levinson report. It's not just letting buildings age out of compliance. And it's not just staffing and programming, and it's not just taxes. There are changes that we can make to how we provide, how students, where students access their services. And that's really that, is that I hope that we as a community can have some good conversations around that, because there is another option. And just because we weren't ready a couple years ago, this conversation today, the one from the last meeting, it's really powerful. And I think people are saying what they want to prioritize and what they need, what you just said, to feel supported. So we really want to look at this report and consider it maybe differently than we did a couple years ago. And I think I'd like to highlight what was said earlier about losing about 40 positions over the last few years since I've been on the board. It's been a lot, and it's been felt over the years and noticed and seen. And now this, in some ways, what's going on right now might be a blessing for us to all really come together and really put programming and services right at the top. And children going to school in buildings that are accessible and safe, right? All of that, still doing the work that needs to be done on them.
any other thoughts on this topic, or we can move into the next discussion item? Seeing none, we'll move on then into the Levinson report. And Patrick had sent us some materials to look at as far as what he's identified as options out of the Nate Levinson report. I don't know if, for our newest board members, if you had a chance to read the Levinson report, if you have any thoughts or questions about what that might say, or if any old board members, have
Direct.
sorry, have any context they want to provide, or if you wanted to start.
No, I think I'm happy to set a little bit of context to what I shared. So at the last few board meetings, there have been comments sort of here and there about the Levinson report, and what about the Levinson report, and what are we doing with that, what are we not doing with that? So I thought it was appropriate for me to focus on sort of the green and the yellow. So the way Nate structured that report was the green sort of options that he outlined aligned well to sort of the interests, I forget exactly the term he used, but they were well aligned to what we wanted. The yellow were somewhat aligned, but there was something about those options that was misaligned, and then the red just weren't aligned very well. I didn't spend any time sort of going into my thoughts on the red options. I focused on the green and the yellow just to kind of share what have we done about some of those things, because there has been some activity on those fronts, and where have we not really moved much and why, just to try and help sort of at least peel back the onion a bit from my own way of thinking relative to those options. For me, so the two documents I shared, both being the strategy, things don't just sort of happen by osmosis. Like you have to be strategic about working toward the end that you desire. We have an ends policy, so we have in some ways outlined the end that we're after. And so we really need to have a strategy to lean on to achieve that end. Lots of different people have lots of different ideas about what the right strategy is. At the end of the day, you need to have a strategy. In the absence of a strategy, you're making decisions just sort of on emotion, on something other than a strategy. So I thought it was really important to kind of outline, like, here's the strategy that we've been working from and some of the work that goes into living that strategy. And then sort of comparing that to the Levinson and what we have done and haven't done and why, and how that relates to the strategy. I felt like we've talked about a lot of parts and pieces of all of that, but I haven't had an opportunity really to put it all in somewhat of a more cohesive sort of frame. So that was my effort with those two documents was, here's the strategy, and here's what we've done and haven't done with the Levinson work, and how all of that connects to the strategy. Not as the be all end all, but as a way to help move the conversation forward in a productive and strategic way, which I think is our responsibility. And frankly, something I've been talking about for at least 5 years now. Like we have this three-legged stool that I've talked about: reasonable taxes, a strong education system, and all the structures that we currently have and have had for decades. We get to pick any two of those three things, which is a wonderful position to be in. Except that picking any one of those is really hard. And that is our reality. We can like it or not like it, but that is our reality. Those are the three options, and we get to pick two of the three. When we say no to higher taxes and we say no to changing the structures, the sad reality is the default is we're taking away from the support and services and programs that we have for our students. That's the third option. Exactly what are those reductions and when do they happen and all that? Like there's a lot of nuance to that. But from broad strokes, that's what we have to work with. So that's sort of the larger frame for what I shared with you, which will be linked to these minutes. So I've shared that with the staff and it'll become public after tonight's meeting.
Patrick, I read your comments and appreciate your taking the time to do that. I was just wondering, how can, getting back to Mike's point, how can the community and the board for that matter help take that to the next level? Because I mean, I just think that in order to get the kind of buy-in for the three-legged stool, we need to have something that is more, a consideration of the report that is much broader than just say what, you and your staff, come up with in your interpretation of what's feasible and what's not feasible. I think this is an opportunity for there to find a way to think a little bit outside the box, maybe in a few instances. Sitting here now, what those are, I just don't know. So I'm kind of curious, maybe from your perspective, how can the board and how can the community help you in your thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess where my mind is going with that is, this idea that I put out a while back, and in terms of what we do with the found time if this budget passes, I think Mike's comments on Front Porch Forum spoke to that as well. The work that needs to happen is, I think you might have said it, Melissa, the coming together, right? Like that work of coming together and figuring out where do we go from here. I think what I shared is some information that can help inform that conversation. But I think in terms of what the help is, I think pretending that we on our own can engage in those really hard conversations that most of us have experienced from a few years ago, like we're going to need to bring in outside support, facilitation to have those conversations and help us work through the various approaches and the thinking and how we respond as a community. Because ultimately the reality is there are a range of different authorities that the board has, the superintendent has, and the community has. And until there's alignment, they're going to be at odds, and we need to get them in sync. And we need to work to build something together as opposed to cling onto as much of what we've had as possible, because if there's one thing that's for sure, our future does not look like what our present looks like. It's not sustainable locally, statewide, something's gonna give. It's what we've been saying for years. Something's going to give at some point. We're going to feel the hurt. We're feeling the hurt now. We haven't felt the hurt of the 48 positions or whatever the number was, because it's been mostly by taking advantage of attrition, but it's here now. We're feeling this in a way that hasn't been surfaced in the recent past. And we have an obligation to do something about that.
I think we did feel the hurt. The teachers felt the hurt, right? Because all of a sudden there's 40 less people to spread the work around. Can I dive into one of these and ask a clarifying question as a board member that doesn't understand this? Can you, somebody, Patrick, maybe explain to me this, like, what is a day in the life of a coach? Because, you know, that's addressed here in the Levinson report. I don't understand. What do the coaches do on the daily basis? How are they reporting out their findings, if that's what their point is? And how do they interact with the teachers and the administration so that I can better understand that, please?
Yeah, so really high level, instructional coaches, their role is to provide job embedded ongoing professional development. That is the sort of gold standard for professional development. The traditional approach of, you know, send a bunch of folks out to trainings in various places and expect that that comes back and has any sort of transformational impact on instruction just never proved to be effective. The professional development model that has proven to be effective, Nate references it in his report as the best approach to improving instructional practices, is this job embedded professional development of instructional coaching. So that, in a nutshell, is what instructional coaches do. That looks like a lot of different things. It can be co-teaching, it can be meeting during planning times with teachers, it can be looking at student data with teachers. They organize student data in a way to help make it more accessible and something that can be responded to. So it looks in a lot of different ways, and it's tailored to the individual relationship between the coach and the teacher.
And how are we measuring currently whether or not those relationships are successful?
The ultimate measure is in student outcomes, and we have multiple measures that we look to, and that's what we report out on in the ends monitoring report. The hard part in education is, as much as we try to apply the science to the art and look at variables and measure the effect of those variables, we very rarely ever get to isolate a variable and say that variable's impact is X. There's always a combination of variables, so it's hard to really pinpoint which one had what effect.
Okay, sorry, one more thing. Sorry.
No.
So when I read this, you know, again, I'm not in a school setting, but when I think about coaches and people that have had an impact on me in my life, they're not coaches, right? They're peers, they're my leaders. And so I was curious as I read through this, and you know, obviously the possible savings is a lot. It's 700,000 on that particular item. I questioned if we couldn't rethink the way we do it. Could we not take some of our senior teachers, teach them how to be instructional coaches, pair them up with some of our newer teachers, right? And then they're working together. Plus I mean, I guess the coaches are embedded in the classroom, but they've maybe seen these kids before, they've worked with them and they know the challenges, or they can pop into a classroom recognizing they have their own classrooms. But I'm just wondering if we shouldn't think outside the box and think of a different way to approach the coaches. I mean, maybe that's, you know, we increase, if we've got 5 coaches and they're the actual teachers, maybe we talked about the stipend thing that was talked about in other pieces, another section of this report. But I'm just wondering if we shouldn't think outside the box, and instead of having additional FTEs that are coaches, we leverage the amazing staff we have already. So just something that came up for me.
That resonates with me a lot, because a lot of conversations that I've had with teachers, not only in the Mausd district, but other districts, the coaching component is hit or miss, it seems. And a lot of times the teachers aren't feeling the effects of it. And so if I know we're measuring it in a different way, but when the teachers are feeling like this isn't really helpful for me, then we're paying $700,000 for it. Yeah, I agree. It needs to be looked at in a different way.
Well, we're on the topic of coaches. I actually have more questions. I want to make sure I understood what you said. Were you saying there's no definitive cause and effect with the coaches and student outcomes? Like, you can't prove a direct correlation and prove outcomes?
From a purely scientific isolating the variable, no, because we can't control the variable. There's always multiple variables.
Okay. My next question is, what is their credentials? Like, what's their education level compared to the teachers they're coaching?
It varies. So the experience and expertise that a coach has, it varies. But they've all had teaching experience. They all have some sort of presented expertise in the area they're coaching in. So our literacy coaches have demonstrated expertise in the area of literacy and math, et cetera. So.
Okay. And then my last question is it, so do they work with every teacher? Like, is there a schedule or is it mandatory?
It is not mandatory, and that's really a critical component to effective instructional coaching, is that it's not an arm of administration, that it's really the relationship between the coach and the teacher is sacred. And when it either is or feels like it's an arm of the administration, the relationship is strained and then the effectiveness goes away.
That makes sense. Sorry, I have one more question then. Are they utilized?
Do we ever ask for feedback from the teachers on their experiences with the coaches?
I can't think of a formal like survey kind of feedback that we've collected. We've gathered more informal feedback from teachers.
I just think it would be valuable also when we're looking at the full impact of these people, because coaches is something that comes up a lot, I think, in conversation. So I'm glad you brought it up. But just understanding for teachers, how is this working? And then being able to, and the coaches too, for that extent, like how is it working for them? And evaluating the value.
Yeah, Mike.
No, can I just, I appreciate the discussion very much, and I just wonder though, if this is the hour to dive into each one, and it's not any complaint about the, like, it's really reasonable points. To me, this is exactly what we as a board should be engaging with, not only as a board, while everybody has to watch us have these debates, but collectively, right? And so it seems to me like these kind of discussion points, and I again really appreciate the Levinson report, and Patrick, you're sharing your thoughts, because to me, it sets a stage for something we can build to throughout the next year, right? We don't build the budget yesterday, like we build next year's budget next month and the month after that and the month after that. And I could easily foresee, for example, at the finance subcommittee, facilities and finance, each month tackling one of these issues, right? Inviting community members to speak to their thoughts on coaches, hearing from teachers on coaches, hearing from board members, reading Patrick's perspective on that, and then really having some firm ground to, as a board, to weigh in with recommendations to Patrick and the administration about how they might consider building the next year's budget in light of that information. And if you did that on coaches, if you did that on each of the aspects of the lesson plan, right, which we prioritize, then it seems like we have a forum to hear community concerns directly that integrates with the actual budget process. And hopefully that gets the community and the budget more aligned while still maintaining the respective roles of the board, the community, and the admin, in the sense that Patrick ultimately still would provide that template of the budget, but would do so now informed by board thinking and community thinking directly. I keep thinking about this April 16th vote, which is a really important vote, I get that, as a stopgap at best. I don't know how you solve all of these issues in 2 weeks, frankly, let alone next year, right? This is something that's gonna ongo for many years. But so I just wonder if we can kind of, I don't know, if not a formal commitment, but like in ourselves, like commit ourselves to trying to get this to the forefront throughout the next year so that we can have a budget that's feels more driven by everybody.
Sorry, go ahead, Beth.
Yeah, I'm seeing this document as really important for next steps. But, and I've been here a year. I feel like I need more information about this, and I was wondering if, I'm sure our newer members would agree, somehow there could be some sort of a presentation or just informational for us, for the public. What is this document? What is this all about? The whys, the hows. I understand what you did with the colors and the formatting and how you put it into context for us. Is there more that we don't see beyond or?
So I was gonna dovetail off of what Mike said, because on top of everything you've brought up, we also have this ends report, this ends policy, these ends that we love to hate. And over the past 3 years since I've been here, it's come up at every annual meeting as something we struggle to follow and like and find helpful. And I see the ends policy and the budget and all this community engagement as really all married together, or if they're not right now, they really should be. The ends policy is how we, and with community feedback and with teacher help and everything, create goals as a strategy template for then how Patrick or any person who's a superintendent to then go forward and do their work strategically. I don't think the board has taken really any extreme ownership on that ends policy or the items we've put into it to make those goals understandable, attainable, measurable, which is something we talk ad nauseum about. And something we need to do better in order to help facilitate the change we're talking about, not only for what we want for our students, but to help inform what the budget might look like because we're informed of what our student needs are. So budget ends, all of it has to be done in sort of incremental pieces as we're going down the road here. So we might dissect the Levinson report one time on a business agenda, and the next time we're looking at another piece, so that by the time we're ready to put together an ends policy, we have really clear idea of what goals we want in that report, so that Patrick has a really clear idea of what his strategy, how his strategy fits into that report, that policy. A lot of work ahead.
Yeah, but to Mike's point, we probably should shift to the current budget. Tonight, right?
I think so.
Start having that
Well,
conversation.
That's absolutely fine. That's our next discussion item anyhow.
The only thing I want to add to this just is that Patrick, having been here probably longer than anybody else, that synopsis, I think, was a bit overdue. Because it was really helpful, but I think we needed, I've been sort of waiting to hear that for a while.
Mhm.
And I know one thing you stated before we had this budget shift, mentioning that having this short-term solution for the 16th, that there might be another plan you're considering that we haven't flushed out yet.
Yeah, well, I think that's, I mean, I definitely have ideas, and I think part of kind of where we landed was recognizing that over the course of the next, we say year, but it's not really a year, it's less than a year when we start building the next budget. We need to engage in a process that generates lots of ideas. And sort of learning from past challenges, right? Engaging in a process that leads to multiple ideas. I have one, I might have more than one, others have ideas, let's surface those ideas. Go through a process that filters those to what we think the community or the board could support and go from there.
And Kathy.
I think what's really important for me as a board member is that Ashley and I are meeting monthly with our principal to find out what is it that the teachers need, what is it that he as an administrator needs, and what is it that we can do as board members to facilitate exactly that kind of a loop. And if we can all make that commitment to our schools, I think it would be a much smoother road as we approach some of the tough decisions we have to make.
I also think board members just being in the school that you're representing and understanding what the climate is in that building is really powerful to be able to understand some of the deeper components of what's happening in our district. It's easy when you're a parent, right? It's a little bit harder when you don't have kids in that school.
I think also having a connection to Mount Abe has been something we've struggled with too. our elementary schools get a lot of attention. Our high school doesn't always get that same level. But let's put a pin in that discussion item, and I think there's room for that idea to take more shape, especially on the community engagement committee side of things. Which is on our agenda. But let's shift into the next discussion item, which is the draft budget presentation.
Ready for me to jump right into that, Mike?
Yeah, I think so.
Can you share screen?
Patrick, will you make that, copy available to Jennifer, so I can just refer to it in the minutes as
Yep.
will be attached?
Stuff.
Yeah, sure.
Switch the slide or the animation. It's abrasive. We'll see. I think it just pops in and then should work from here. There you go.
Wonder, may need to open Google Slides, see if that works. Hopefully there's no formatting issue.
It's a draft. So. Awesome, we're good.
Can you move the little dialogue box in?
Yeah, they had a word one here as well. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so, so I'm gonna jump in. This is, a wonderful example of some of the sort of strange ways that sometimes we as a board feel like our hands are tied. So in order to not violate open meeting laws, we couldn't collectively work on this presentation unless it's in an open session. So what you're gonna be seeing is a draft of a presentation that will be presented in its final form next week. For you, take it in, wonderful. Know that there may be some subtle tweaks. Know that this was largely driven by sort of me trying to capture the essence of the original budget, the current landscape of education funding in Vermont, the revised budget, and where we go from there. I'll make a plea even before we start to the board, like this is where your feedback comes in so that I can update this, and then there can be a presentation that reflects all of your concerns as equally as mine before the night. So with that little disclaimer, I'll jump into this as if it were a presentation. I actually feel totally comfortable. I think we should feel free to stop me along the way, because otherwise it gets real weird. And then you can point out like where we might want to change these sorts of things. So with that, the basic sort of structure of this is I briefly want to talk about what Ashley raised, the sense that this is not a unique issue to MAUSD. This is a budgetary landscape that's really unique. Talk a little bit about the rationale behind the first budget, the proposed budget that failed the original vote. Then give some of those specifics about what's different between the second budget and that first budget. And then, yeah, I can say where that goes. Forgive my terrible AI art. It was like 11:30 last night. I was very curious to be playing around with that on the internet. That's supposed to be a broken.
I think you've done well.
Oh, well,
Like, I think
thank
you've
you.
done
It's
very
supposed to be a broken school that's held together with money. I don't know if it quite captured that, but that's how I felt at 11:30 last night to some extent. So forgive me for that. So what's the current state? You look across the state and a third, give or take, of all proposed budgets failed, which I don't know, I've been here 10 years and it sounds kind of unheard of to me. So clearly there are lots of factors that are statewide that are driving up education spending extensively. Across these failed budgets, I found a Burlington Free Press article that said the sort of range of increase in property tax for those failed budgets was something between 15 and 30%. And I get it, like those are really big numbers. But again, I want to point out that those are big numbers in each of these districts, including our own. And if you want to take kind of a more average projected before the first set of votes that were held, the state projected that the property taxes would increase on average something like 18 to 19%, largely driven by increased educational spending across the state. And so before we get into the details of our particular budget and our revised budget, I don't think we can understand the consequences of those budgets on property taxes until we understand that lots of factors that affect those property taxes are statewide and somewhat beyond our local control. And I think this makes it really difficult because we still nevertheless have to gain some ownership over our own spending, the bits that we do control. But I fear that that level of ownership, that level of local control has become such a small slice of the pie that it makes it even more difficult to affect change within the district in a meaningful way in terms of spending. Okay, so the failed budget votes. This is a slide that I showed in one of our sort of informational presentations before the run-up to the first vote. And it was really just supposed to provide some context for how we got to the 24-25 budget. And the short of it is that the school board recommended a level service budget. This was a way of saying, we want to keep the same staffing and services and student supports that the voters approved in the 23-24 budget and carry them over, right? Obviously, the 23-24 and 24-25 budgets weren't the same number, right? There were lots of new constraints, whether it was the weighting formula, the expiration of COVID-related funds, rising healthcare costs, rising statewide educational costs, so decreased yield. Essentially, as the entire state spends more, we get less per pupil as the starting point. All of those contribute to a much larger end value, even if we were just trying to maintain the same services that were approved before, right? So really simply put, that initial budget that was proposed said, we'd like to keep the same educational, social, emotional supports that we as a community already established as our priorities. And that got us to the proposed budget. This is comparing in some ways the proposed budget that failed to the previous year's budget. And it has total expenses, and that was like an 8.5% increase. There's a little extra revenue, so that offsets some of those. In general, that maintaining the same services ultimately costs in terms of educational spending about 7% more. I want to point out that because of the new weighting of students with Act 127, paradoxically, even though we're spending about 7% more in terms of our educational spending, the one thing that we control is our bottom line, this spending per pupil, actually decreased year to year, right? So on the surface, you might expect that the decreased spending per pupil should have or could have resulted in very similar taxes or a small increase. But that wasn't the case, right? So we have the same services, but total expenses increased by 8.5%, education spending increases by 7.3%, but we have a decrease in per pupil spending. That's a good thing for local control of budgets. But even though we had a decrease of a little over 1% in per pupil spending, as you all will know, and I don't need to tell you, the proposed budget would have increased tax rates, property tax rates, and income dependent on around 13 to 18%, depending on whether you pay property or income and depending upon which town you happen to reside in. So where was the disconnect between the funding, which the budget actually decreased per pupil's funding, and then the impact on taxes? Two things I think are really pertinent here. The first is this pretty substantial decrease in the statewide yield. So if everybody across the state is spending more, even though our per pupil spending was 1% less, you can see in this first column here, apparently this doesn't want to show up on that screen, that's fun, that the estimated homestead tax rate, that base rate, was nevertheless higher for the 25 than the 24 budget. And that was simply because even though we were spending less per pupil, the state was allocating less per pupil across the board to reflect overall large increases spending across the state. And when you couple that with the common level of appraisal, raising property values, our homes being perhaps not valued equitably across other areas, when you apply that sort of factor, that got us to that final column of anywhere from here 13 to 16%, and projected at the median level 18% if you're paying by income. So my take there was the board presented a level service budget to the community that said, yes, we heard your support for these priorities last year. We don't want to take those away. It came with a hefty price tag, and perhaps not surprisingly, It was too hefty of a price tag. Right, so the vote fails. So that leads us to our revised MASD budget. How can we that's supposed to be a Phoenix rise out? Okay.
Got it.
Wow. Yeah, well, I didn't type war zone to be fair, but that has seen better days.
I think you need a caption under there.
I'll be, and to be clear, like this is being created later and later in the night. So if you get this is a small plea. I'm a sleep scientist in my day job. I study why we need to sleep. This embodies, you should get a good night's sleep. So, there you have it, right? We know now that we want to try to maintain priorities for our district, for our students, but now we need to do so at a cost that's more palatable to our communities. And that's where this revised budget comes in. So essentially, we listened, we heard substantial community input that basically said the original budget was too expensive. Obviously, there's more nuance to that. I get it. It's about the total number. It's about where those dollars are being spent. But there was substantial pushback and some combination of the two that led to a rejection of that budget. So wanting to maintain district services, supports for students, we collectively as a board instructed the superintendent to develop a series of revised budgets, each of which at different levels of reductions of overall increases on property tax. We evaluated those proposals and we ultimately recommended one that we hoped would mitigate anticipated increases in taxes while still doing whatever it could to minimize reductions in support. That's the revised budget that's put forth to the communities that will have an opportunity to weigh in formally on April 16th. So what are the specific differences that got us from the original proposed budget and now this revised budget? This is a long list that Patrick provided us as the board in his presentation. I put that up there now. I'm sure this presentation, we'll have to figure out whether the draft gets posted and then we post the final one, but in some form or another, either after this meeting or certainly after the April 9th, this list will be posted. I don't really know the protocol either way, but we'll figure that out. But the short of this is that Patrick presented a reduced budget that largely got to that value, or got to that lower value by not filling positions that hadn't been filled in the previous year's budget. So commitments that we wanted to make as a community that we had budgeted for these positions, but that we were unable to find individuals to fill those positions. So this is like some vacated positions at Mount Abe, some Addison Consortium positions, the 1.0 vacant maintenance utility position, and so on. There was also some reduction in this Addison Consortium program, including 2 positions and some money for supporting that program. And my sense from the board meeting was that this was a potential change that wasn't purely driven by the budget, but was actually driven by reassessing the purpose of that program and whether those services might be met in other ways. 2 other really important things to point out that were necessary to get to the bottom line of the revised budget were reducing construction services by a little over $250,000. So these are the monies that are allocated each year to maintain school buildings and for capital improvements. And also taking a little over $300,000 from the Education Reserve Fund. The current balance is about $1 million and about a third of that would be paid into this year's budget as a way to essentially offset taxes. Right, take some of the money we already have, use that to pay for some of the expenses in a sort of one-time fashion so that the impact of this year's property tax is minimized or mitigated a little bit. So what's this revised budget look like in terms of numbers? Think of that. Oh, and also a summary of that slide, which is too much for me to digest, but I will give to you as well. This revised budget, just like the original proposed budget, attempts to maintain all of the services that were provided last year. Right. The only reductions are construction fund, using the education reserve, and essentially not filling positions that weren't filled the previous year. So maybe it doesn't meet the aspirations of last year's budget, but it might meet the reality of the services that were provided. This revised budget, as presented, wouldn't necessitate any RIF notices. Oh, sorry, that's a lie. RIF notices occurred. It wouldn't require any RIFs, the actual reduction in forces, to be clear. And it substantially reduces the anticipated tax increases. Whether substantially enough, that's for the community to describe. But I will show you what those numbers look like on the next slide. At some point I switched conventions here and we may want to change that. Like the blue seems kind of positive to me and the gray seems like kind of negative. So there's a little key. Even though all those things are great and I'm feeling good about that, it gets to that point, I think, in an unsustainable, and this is me, I should be very clear, we can get editing there if this is not the standpoint of the board, in an unsustainable means, right? We can't draw $300,000 from the education reserve funds indefinitely. We can't not maintain buildings indefinitely because then you run into bigger problems than we have already. So you can maintain potentially those services, you can reduce the tax burden, but this might be a short-term solution to a really long-term problem. What's it look like overall? The left column are numbers for the failed budget vote. The right column are the revised budget that's being voted on again on the 16th. You can see that there's a significant reduction in total expenses. Just to provide a little clarity, because I know this came up at least on a post in the Bristol Front Porch Forum, you might notice that there is this sort of strange bump in revenue, like we all of a sudden made a whole bunch of more money. This is just accounting, right? This is the $305,000 that we're pulling from the Education Reserve Fund. That doesn't count as a reduction in expenses. We're still spending the money. We're just not paying for it with taxes. We're paying for it with the Education Reserve Fund. So the difference between the revenue on the left column and the right column reflects that rating is probably too strong of a word for some, certainly for me, but the use of the Education Reserve Funds, that's offsetting some of that total expenses. In the end, you can see that this has the net result of reducing spending and reducing the per pupil spending down to about 14,600. And the bottom speaks to that. It's a little over $1 million in reduced spending, coupled with that $300,000 in additional revenue. And that's how we get to the sort of bottom line. Ultimately, the board asked Patrick to come to a bottom line that wouldn't increase taxes year over year by more than 10% in any of our communities. That was the sort of instruction that we went to, and this number gets us there. Again, lots more information than maybe is particularly necessary right now. The left is showing kind of the homestead tax rates, the CLA, those sorts of things. Maybe pertinent to our discussion, the final column, what's the bottom line to your budget? That's the percent increase from last year's budget to the new revised budget. So Bristol would see after the homestead tax rate, after the CLA on 9.99%, cutting it razor thin below that 10% margin so that we can still try to maintain services. Moncton at 9.72, New Haven at 7, and Starksboro at negative 24.65. But I'd say don't get super excited about that Starksboro in the sense that it's still going to have the same impact in terms of cost, more or less. The reason for that is Starksboro has been recently reappraised. And so it's going to be a lower tax rate on higher homestead values. As a result, it may vary from house to house, but the net result should look something like Bristol, Moncton, New Haven in terms of the cost to an individual. Right. Obviously, again, with the caveat that your house may have been appraised more or less than your neighbors, and that might slightly affect what you pay relative to them. So if you care about the little more details, this column right here, the change per 100,000 assessed from failed budget, that's how many dollars per $100,000 of assessed value your property taxes would increase. The column to the left of that is showing for the revised budget. So we're talking a little over $100 reduction with the revised budget in Bristol and in Moncton and in New Haven, right? And again, some uncertainty with Starksboro, but I think it's fair to say that roughly equivalent sort of changes there. So maybe to summarize that, the revised budget attempts to, like the original budget, be a level service budget, a budget that says these are community priorities. We want to try to maintain them as well as we can. And it does so by some short-term fixes and from not filling vacancies that were unable to be filled in the previous year. So where does that lead us now? This one, I knew when I made it was wrong, like, it was supposed to be sort of optimistic, we were driving somewhere, but that's driving straight into a waterfall. But I wasn't gonna change that at like 1 a.m, so that's what you get. This is a draft, by the way. I will point out again.
Go back to.
We can revise that. So what does this mean? In the immediate future, you are here today, thank you. You may or may not join us next week for the April 9th version, where we'll continue to have information, continue to have dialogue, and have a final version of a presentation like this, where we talk about the budget revote and hopefully inform the community with the kind of information that you need so you can make an informed decision on this budget. April 16th, vote. Regardless of your standing, yes, no, vote. That's engagement in any way. You'll have a chance to vote on this revised budget. What happens then? If we approve the budget, voters approve that, then we adopt this revised budget, right? Less than a 10% property tax increase in all of our communities, level services, probably a short-term fix. We may need some revising, given what I've heard today, but maybe it's correct. If we, as communities, reject that, there's a chance for another vote, Patrick, is that right or no? So there'd be, good, so I wasn't totally on base. There'd be a chance for the board and the administration to go back to the drawing board for one more vote, is that where we're at?
As many as we can fit in before the end of June.
As many votes as we can, oh my gosh. We'll just-
Every vote a day.
Yeah, every day of May.
The sort of trigger is if we don't have an approved budget by the end of June, then the sort of the default that we continue with is the assumption that we have this year's level of spending, and statutorily, we can only borrow up to 87% of this year's budget for operating capital.
Okay, good. So,
And there's a whole lot more weeds we can get into with that if you want to, but
okay, I think
Probably
later,
unnecessary.
yeah. Yeah, perfect. So with that, there'd be chance for revision. The general sense that I have, and certainly I want to hear from the board, but is that it would be very difficult to further decrease educational spending while still maintaining that level service budget. Right? Whether or not that's 100% true, like whether there are places in the margins, I don't know if I can speak to that, but I get the sentiment that poses an even higher hurdle to maintain that service while still reducing costs. The long-term future, and I'm gonna start sounding like a broken record, so you can turn me off as you see fit. School budgets across the state are ballooning. Like, we're not unique in this sense. As budgets rise across the state, the yield will continue to drop. It will be harder and harder to maintain property taxes at an acceptable level while spending even the same amount of money, right? That will nevertheless increase taxes. We do have some degree of control over our local spending. I think it's important to point that out, and I think based on comments tonight and discussions around the table, it feels like there's a real commitment to think about where those levers are. Again, I'm not sure if those levers can be pulled this budget by this timeline, maybe. I'm less optimistic. But it does feel like a goal as we move forward into future budget cycles. In the end, that local control affects the bottom line of the per pupil spending. Again, not to be the bearer of bad news, but like, we reduced that this year, right? That number was smaller than last year, and nevertheless, we saw this change in property taxes. This again shows me some of the limits of our local control. Okay. What's the oh, I put these all in blue, so apparently I was optimistic about them anyways. What do we have to do? I hope what we said tonight, and this is the broken record part to me, we as the board, the administration, all of you have to figure out how do we engage, how do we explore cost-efficient solutions, help curtail some of these rising costs, but nevertheless direct those funds to the services that we prioritize, right? And to the services that we as a community deem most necessary for our students. And that's what I have for a draft. So I really am open. I mean, like I said, there's plenty of things we can amend as we go forward, but
The one thing that jumps out to me is that we don't say anything about the Munsell Ave vote. And if that truly was connected to people's misunderstanding of that purchase and where that money was coming from, should we say something?
Yeah.
just to clarify that.
So we're going to stop sharing now, or do you want to go back?
Oh,
to the
no, I
question,
think,
or-
I don't, yeah, you can stop. There were some extra slides as things came up, but I think we're fine. Yeah, I hear you. I hesitated in this draft to include it in the sense that because I don't have very definitive answers for what we as a board and as a district are actually going to do about that.
Can we just say like that vote did not pass?
Yeah.
And that the lease does expire in October 2024, and the board will be in discussion about next steps and what needs to
Does that feel like a good future direction?
happen. Yeah,
Like, we recognize also that this is sort of intermixed with the central office location. We as a board will need to continue with the community to explore options, long-term options, something along those lines.
yeah.
I like that a lot.
So I agree with everything that was just said. What we heard at finance committee was also like the price tag that was tagged to that ask of the community. Where are those dollars now? What's happening with them? So like helping the community understand where that money is.
Yeah.
That would have been used.
That would have been used, exactly.
Yep, beautiful.
Can you do me a
Well,
favor?
currently in this new budget, Patrick, that money is still in the construction services line. That's where it was to begin with.
Okay,
Um, we weren't asking for new dollars for that. We were simply using construction services line out of the budget, which would have restricted our ability to do other capital improvements. But either we're going to do those other capital improvements, or we're gonna hold on to the money for what we do need to do with central.
that's helpful clarification. I didn't realize that's where it was. Thank
Yeah.
you, Steve.
So can you make the leap that the $350,000 in capital improvements is now coming out of the money that would have been spent in the purchase of Munsell Avenue?
Well, it's not directly. It's just out of the budget of construction services.
It's the same line.
Right.
but-
It's the same
Right.
line.
So if you want to know where that 300,000 is coming from.
There could be some explanation of that.
One thing I had, just the accountant in me, in the slide that had the grid, like what the budget was, what the proposed is. Can we put the change column back in so people can do math, but let's not make them have to do it.
Yeah,
Let's put
I'm with
that
you.
in there. Yep.
Between the revised and the original,
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
easy.
That's what accountant means.
The other thing, Mike, you just said, I'm not sure about this, I have to think it through more, but when you had the slides with the tables, you kind of skipped over a lot of the information, probably for good reason. Maybe we don't need to have them in the
Yeah.
presentation, make them a little bit more readable and simpler. There's a way to do that.
Yeah, and I'd also, I mean, maybe this goes to a broader question about sort of the ideal timeline of one of these presentations, like this attention, I feel is like, when is too much information?
Right.
Too much?
Right.
When is a summary too much of a condensation of that information?
No, I know.
And so, I know, I'm totally with you. I guess I'm open to ideas from the board and then happy to hear comments afterwards or talk individually, like, where do you find that line that's useful? That you don't feel overwhelmed with information, but you feel like you have enough information. Because tonight, as I was kind of breezing through a draft presentation, like, we could actually walk through those things if it's useful. Or to your point, if this draft presentation, that kind of summary that I jumped to well in the moment is really the level we want, then I'm perfectly on board with saying, yeah, let's cut those columns that you don't even address.
And you're specifically talking about, like the homestead rate in the CLA, and then you're talking about not going through each of those.
Well, some of the ones, yeah, I mean, Mike sort of kind of glossed over a number of them. I'm just, again, it gets back to what Mike just said. You have to find the right balance of having enough information, but not having too much information. That's all.
Personally, I felt it was spot on.
Yeah.
So I thought you had a good mix of both.
So maybe in those particular cases. Like, yeah, please.
Sorry, just one other thing. I agree. I think the presentation was great. It was a really good overview for anywhere, and I don't remember what slide it was on, that there's abbreviations. Can we define those for the public?
Yeah.
I tried, but I am sure I missed some, so.
And maybe it was there and I missed it.
Nope,
but
no, I will double check through.
abbreviations can mean 100 things, so.
Yes. Yeah, and actually Lloyd had sent me a glossary, a document that I.
I mean, maybe we could
No, no,
tack that on
no,
the
but
end.
actually,
Yeah.
it's not wrong.
Yeah.
A sort of review that we could have
Yeah.
public facing so that there was like a single source for like the myriad of abbreviations that we throw around all the time.
Yes.
And so we're working on that, but it's also easy to do this in the moment as well.
Mhm. No, that's great. Thank you.
I mean, I can also end with like cute pictures of my kids.
Yeah, I mean, not.
Yes.
driving into a wall.
That's always
That's a
good.
joke. Let's do it.
Okay, perfect. So we can do that too. I'm like definitely not above that. I do that in class all the time.
You know, or, I mean, I loved your graphics, so please don't take the time to put us again. We also have some amazing pictures out there of our community schools, right? The Facebook page, you guys do a great job, all the elementary schools, MAUSD, like, of displaying our kids. Like, maybe we use some of those.
But then I'd
That's
have-
what's important.
Then I'd have to be on Facebook, so.
No.
I-
Maybe send you.
No,
It was just a
we can
thought.
look. I
like,
love that
you know,
idea. It's
for
much better
sake
than
of-
that nonsense.
Yeah, seeing the kids is what
Yes,
is important.
I
So
agree.
I love seeing all those pictures.
I think that's perfect.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts for this draft budget presentation?
Yeah, and the idea is I'll bring these comments back to this, I'll amend as suggested. And that way we bring the whole board's voice to the sort of final presentation next week at the informational. And you can also, I think, send me emails individually too, as you see fit, like, I'm really open to suggestions, yeah.
And then will we have access to that I've not seen Front Porch Forum in months, so, whatever you put there, it sounded, I saw positive feedback from that, and we used to do something through Krista where we'd send it to her and then she would say, hey, somebody from each town, let me know that you got this posted. So,
So we actually have individual town front porch forums now. So we have one for Bristol, New Haven, Starkville, Moncton, and I have 4 board members who have volunteered to do that posting for us.
awesome.
So we're already doing that work. It's just, I don't have to solicit a volunteer each time now. I just send it to one person and it's done.
Yeah, so I did have a post yesterday, 2 days ago in Bristol, that actually, well, not surprisingly, follows a sort of similar trajectory. So if that's useful, we can talk about
Yeah.
whether that's another way to get information out there, or whether just sharing this would be.
Yeah, because the sooner we get that, that would be what I would want to have to go to a select board member.
Oh, perfect.
That would be the presentation.
Is there a way, you narrated it so incredibly, and I was like, on the seat, you know, is there a way, technology wise, for us to create a narrated version that could go on the face, you know, like, we have all sorts of learners in our community, and
I
to
did
just
this last time,
see,
too.
you did narrate a video?
So the answer is yes.
Oh, okay.
So
That's great.
we can do that. Yeah, for the previous budget, we posted that. I could do that for this as well. That way, if people don't make it to the 2nd or the 9th, I just have to figure out how to talk consistently into a mic. That's the real challenge, quite frankly.
How many likes did you get?
Yeah, no. Again, I don't know. But yeah, if that's something that the board would like, that's easy enough. I find this a lot easier to do than
You were
talking
really
just
good.
to myself at the computer, so it might not quite be this, but it'll be an approximation. for sure.
The other
Yeah,
thing that.
what you do at 11 o'clock.
The other thing that I was just thinking about, in terms of kind of the history of community engagement that I've seen, when we were doing the Levinson's things and the community gatherings, and we like filled rooms with people. And that kind of turnout has, COVID happened, obviously, but that turnout also hasn't really happened since. And it might be too soon for this idea to ever happen for next week, but what if, since we are still driven by our small towns, what about, just throwing this out there, like a viewing session in the town halls or Holly Hall or whatever, where community members could come together for what would be next week's presentation and view it together instead of coming here? in a more like community
Centric.
centric, yeah, thank you. And again, I don't know if that's feasible for next week, we're on a timeline, but for the future, we had way better turnout, or there, I just noticed way better turnout when it was in your hub, even though we're talking about a full district, decision.
Yeah, we've had a lot of community interest about towns getting to know their representatives and having one-on-one conversations with them. So that's something we just discussed today in Community Engagement Committee as well, to really figure out how we can facilitate that, exactly what you're talking about, not only for budget stuff, but for everything.
Like
going
come to
forward.
your town
Yeah.
hall
Talk to your
to
representative.
hear how
Yeah.
things are going. I mean, I feel like with consolidation had good things and bad things. Part of the bad thing is we lost that internal town feeling. And it would be one way to kind of bring that back, even though we are functioning under the same governance.
Well, and it's a different climate because you can have a give and take with a board member instead of having this kind of a situation under policy governance where we take the public comment and we don't have a chance to respond to anybody. And it's a much more productive and fruitful kind of a gathering.
Well, that's not just policy and governance, so that's the Robert's Rules of Order we follow, so you could think about that, but. Yeah,
Let's say timeline, you want to do public comment?
yeah, I would love to do public comment. Are people feeling like they've given all their comments to Mike?
If
Yeah,
great job.
people email me,
Really good.
right, and we have some time before next week to incorporate this.
Super clear.
All right, so at this time, we'll open the floor back up for public comment. Round 2. Go ahead.
Sorry, guys, talking a lot tonight.
Sorry.
Thank you. One thing really would be helpful is standardized terms for what categories we're gonna be putting money into. So for instance, there's construction, there's maintenance, and then there's custodian/maintenance. So what do all those things mean? What items are in those categories? Because to me, I'm like, well, construction services, as you said, I don't want to take away from repair and maintenance. That needs to happen, but construction services is not the same as repair and maintenance or custodian. So what is it that's in construction services? What is in maintenance and what's in the custodian/maintenance? What do those things mean? And have it standard across all the formats so that every year I know what those categories are. And having, like you said, a community forum where we can give informal feedback so that we can ask the community and say, these are the priorities that we have. And I do agree that the community has spoken that we do want a certain level of service, but not necessarily meaning that it has to be that same dollar amount. We want the level of service, meaning we have this many teachers because we need this many teachers. Our kids need these programs. So if that costs this amount of dollars, we still want the same level of service. That doesn't mean that we want to cut those positions. It means that what do we need to do in the budget to make it work so that we can get our level of service, not just a level service budget? Because that is a sacrifice to our entire community by removing necessary positions that if we have to choose in these categories and we have advanced knowledge of what that means, and we can give our input on what these choices are going to be. Because right now I'm hearing that I'm here speaking and that it doesn't even matter, because between now and April 16th, my say doesn't make a difference. The budget is set. So I either decide to vote yes for the budget or I vote no and hope that someone will listen. But what I'm hearing, and maybe I heard it wrong, but the next meeting is just another presentation of the current revised budget. But is there any chance between now and April 16th that any of these suggestions will actually be heard? Like, am I just totally a misunderstanding? But that's what I heard tonight, that my say doesn't matter for this budget. I either vote yes or I vote no and hope someone will listen.
I appreciated your presentation. It was great. So the questions that I want, or the statements I want to leave with you we have under 1,000 students, K through 12. So what if somebody asks that next week? You have less students than you have. You're spending $35,000 per student. I don't have the answers, but I want you to have the answers. The other thing is we have decreasing pupil spending, but we also have a tragic decrease in the number of pupils. So we need to look at this. This is what the public is going to look for. And somehow we have to have a better way. I communicated with the forum, maybe you have more clout, that if I write something, I don't want to depend on Mike to put it on for Bristol. If it's important and they scrutinize what goes on, I should be allowed to put something that's educational on the forum. So maybe with all you pushing for the pressure, this may help us next fall when the budget should be open to all. That's the time you do a budget, is in the fall. And people should respond to that, not now. You're all tired from all this stuff. So leaving with that, we need to know also, I'm really concerned about the RIF. I've been RIFed, but I didn't lose my job. It was stressful. So it sounds the same. You ripped everybody because of the contractual issues, and I would like an answer for that. So it's not fair to the teachers to wonder if they're going to be ripped, but it sounds like from your presentation, there will be no rifts unless the vote gets voted down for the second time. Thank you.
I thank you for that presentation. That was super helpful. I'm trying to wrap my head around yield and CLA, and I will not pretend to understand any of it. Excuse me. I do feel the need to clarify something that came up about double-digit salary increases or about negotiations. There are, as you all know, but the community might not know, the ongoing negotiations are for support staff. So our current negotiated agreement for licensed professionals, we're on year 3. Year 1 was a 4.5% increase, you know, because you were there, I think. Year 2, 4% increase, and we're on year 3 with a 3.5% increase. I just want to make sure that the community doesn't feel like that licensed teachers are right now currently asking for a double-digit increase. Now we have negotiations happening next year, and what sort of increase we ask for will probably depend on the consumer price index at the time. When we negotiated the last agreement 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago, those numbers were consistent with inflation at the time. Now, people who are currently asking for a double-digit increase are educational support professionals, who currently, I was peeking at their current contract, and they range from $18 per hour through $30, depending on the job position. But I just want to be clear that the people asking for double-digit increases are educational assistants who support students with particular special needs, behavioral assistants, custodians and maintenance workers, and administrative assistants. Those are some of the broad categories covered by that contract. So I just want to be clear that, and whether or not people in those positions deserve a double-digit increase, depending on our current cost of living, our current consumer price index, that's for negotiators to decide, I guess. Okay, a second different point I'd like to make is, I think I heard some people on the board saying that they'd like to hear teachers share our perspective on the impact of the coaching model, and definitely overall about some budget priorities. And I think I said this at the last meeting, and I'll say again, we would be very happy to share our thoughts at future meetings. It's not clear whether we can squeeze it in between now and the revote. But moving on longer term, depending on what happens with this vote, we would be more than happy to share our thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Any other public comment at this time?
Just a very short comment. I feel like if a lot of trauma and like the shock of all the rifts that happened might have been a little less hard to take if, I know you didn't have to do it, but if you had said how much was also going to be cut from the administrative budget, just not specific positions, but maybe a dollar amount that would have made the blow seem a little more equal.
Wendy, is your hand up again?
Yes, it is. Sorry, I didn't realize it stayed up before.
Okay, go ahead.
I just want to again say, you know, that the public is concerned about cuts, possible cuts coming from staff and not central office. And I understood people to say that we don't know if cuts will come from central office, but yet I'm looking at the information that was handed to us and the reductions from the budget. There is nothing in there listed about cuts from central office or administration. So it looks like the information that was given to the public is that there will be no cuts in central office or administration if this budget fails. Or for this budget, I'm sorry, for this budget that we are now voting on. So that really concerns me. I feel like we're not really being heard. In a lot of areas, I feel like we are being heard, and I want to clarify that. And I appreciate all the questions, the hard questions that the board is asking. I feel like really trying and you're listening. However, I'm feeling like administration is not listening to the fact that Bristol or Addison Northeast cannot afford that kind of a budget in central office. Thank you.
Any last public comments? Okay. Thank you all for being here. It means a lot to us that you're here. And I hope you continue to come and talk to us. I don't think we need to do the meeting evaluation for tonight. We'll save those for our regular business meetings. The next thing is a motion to adjourn. Motion. Melissa? Second. Kathy, all those in favor of adjourning at 8:48 p.m., please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Erin.